A very warm welcome to the program. My name is Felicity Ezewuike. Dubai's Expo City will from November 30 host the 2023 UN Climate Change Conference COP28. Almost every country in the world will participate in negotiations over how to address the climate crisis, limit global temperature rise, and support vulnerable communities to adapt. Our conversation today is a review of Africa's agenda at the conference. This is important because climate experts say whilst Africa has the lowest per capita fossil fuel emissions of any region globally, it faces the most severe challenges due to climate change. The negative effects on the continent have become increasingly evident through disasters like floods, earthquakes, and drought. 7 out of 10 most vulnerable countries by climate change in 2021 were in Africa. Climate change is forecast to push an additional 78 million people into chronic hunger by 2050, over half of them in sub-Saharan Africa. Experts, they worry about the continent's limited capacity to respond and adapt to ongoing climate disasters, which is mainly due to lower levels of economic development, which itself is closely linked to historic emissions. So, it is agreed that Africa must go to COP28 with an agenda. But there doesn't seem to be a generally accepted consensus. At the just concluded Africa Climate Summit, ACS, which took place in September, AU member states signed the Nairobi Declaration, which is proposed to serve as a basis for Africa's common position in the global climate change process to COP28 and beyond. But discerning voices say the document does not reflect a consensus and the best interest of African nations. My guest on One Slot today is the CEO and founder, Integrated Africa Power, Chigozie Nweke-Eze. Thank you very much for giving us your time on One Slot.
Yeah, thank you so much, Felicity, for having me.
The conference, the purpose is to agree on policies to limit global emissions. It's been 28 years in the making. Give us a brief and honest assessment of the impact it has had, if any, over the years.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Of course, it's been a long time since these negotiations have started. And one would think that by now something much more tangible than this would have come out of it. But I think it is very fair and important to note some of the good things that has also happened or come out of this. For instance, in 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed by 196 countries in the world, agreeing all together to cut down on their emissions. And this was facilitated using nationally determined agreements. And so this is an important step, for instance. And of course, there is no other major platform to get the whole world together to agree on cutting down on global emission and averting all the negative effects of climate change. So it's still important to get these conferences going on in the future. However, there needs to also be more and more improvements, more and more innovation, and more backing up of said agreements and theories with concrete actions on the ground.
It is one thing to talk about policies and way forward. It's another thing to follow the ones that has already been established. We know that there is a protocol established, legally binding obligations for developed countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Africa faces the list. Let's start from there to understand the level of commitment so far in implementing that protocol to its later.
Yeah, of course, it's not an easy thing to implement because different developing countries, insofar as they all have one thing in common, that is to say that they want to industrialize and improve their economic growth and development, it is still different in they are all different in their different stages of development and growth, and their different endowment of resources, their different financial budget capacity, population, and so on and so forth. So there is bound to still be a little bit of an unequal commitments and actions to all of these agreements, including the protocols. So this means that there needs to be actually more streamlined and narrowed down country-specific and adaptable solutions, taking into considerations the different situations of each of these different countries. So I think this is important, and to also measure each country according to their own standards. Yeah.
All right. The idea is to have an agenda. Before we get to talk about the Nairobi Declaration, I'd like you to please remind us, what is the current state of climate change in Africa, and what are some of the major challenges that the continent continues to face?
As you know, it was revised recently that Africa contributes only about 3% of the global emissions. So it is very important to start by noting that most of the emission does not come from Africa. However, it's also been proven that most of the effects of climate change is going to affect mainly sub-Saharan African countries, because they're usually located at the fringes where, floods could easily happen, where droughts could easily happen, and so on and so forth. So it's very, very important to bring up the questions of energy justice, ecological justice in tackling this. That is to say that there has been countries that has historically contributed to the climate change effects we are seeing today, and that they should also take up more of the responsibilities in terms of facilitating, trying to correct this mistake. Of course, some things are already going on, but more clearly needs to be done. African countries, and just together with other developing countries, are not just battling with reducing their impacts on climate change. They are also very strongly moving to improve their livelihoods, to improve energy access, for instance. And are very wary to be faced with this, with the decision of choosing clean energy and any other available energy, because electricity, for instance, is a very vital component to economic growth and development. It's just a sample. How do one then incentivize the more adoption of more climate-friendly energy technologies that could now help us help these countries to choose them rather than not choose them because of financial difficulties or financial limitation, and so on and so forth. So all these things are the things that has been discussed. The importance of climate finance provision, the importance of post-climate finance provision, the importance of carbon taxation. All these are ways in which finance and concrete funding could actually come up to innovate, to actually catalyze the movement and the progress of countries, especially in the global south.
How much of these challenges you've highlighted is captured in the Nairobi Declaration that was signed at the ACS in September? It's supposed to serve as a common position for Africa, I mean, in the efforts for the global climate change process. But there are voices saying that that declaration wasn't done, well, there wasn't a consensus, really. Have you heard the argument? And if yes, what's your view?
Yeah, of course. Such arguments would always come up in a world, forum like that, in a big forum like that, consisting of African countries, 54 of them. Just the same way that many criticisms and comments will come after each COP and any other of such gatherings. But as I said earlier, these gatherings are still important anyway, because the real solutions to problem usually starts by having a conversation about it. Now, this conversation about it may not be perfect, may not reach the levels it should, but at least it's a starting point. Let's also remind ourselves that, of course, even within Africa, where we have 54 different countries, you also still have a level of inequalities, a level of different priorities, different countries. Some countries are very rich in oil and gas. Some countries are not so rich in oil and gas, but rich in renewable energy resources. So it's easier for them to really choose that option and move forward in climate change mitigation. Some other countries are really poorer than their other. Some other countries have huge population. Other ones have are located more in the north and are facing more the impact of climate change, such as drought. Food access is a problem. Water access is a problem. While other countries are located in a more favorable location. Some countries are landlocked, while other countries are more open. So, of course, there are that differences, but at the same time, it is very, very important again for the continent to continue to move, to come to one voice that would now be very strong and laudable. It is not beneficial for the African continent to come to a global event like COP28, for instance, and have different views. It is important that they come with one voice. With one voice, you are able to become louder and more likely to be heard. Yeah, so of course, the ACS having its limitations from here and there, it's a good start that I can encourage that we need to continue to make such a move.
All right, I'll come back to the first part of the question about the declaration. But for now, I'll come back to the second part, rather, of the declaration. But now I want you to go back to the first part of the question I asked, and that's what that document contains. What are the key facts in that declaration that you think is good and, can push Africa forward in the quest to improve the climate condition?
Yeah, I think that one thing that really very much stands out is the question of climate finance and the position of climate finance in making this happen, and the stance of Africans in terms of their position that this is not a begging position, so to say, but this is a question of trying to get what is required, for the world to move forward, knowing that Africa itself is in a position of contributing less. So I think that there has to be a much more consideration on what constitutes climate finance, what enables its flow into the continent and into the individual countries. What we have had in the past has been a lot of promises when it comes to such climate financing and governance, so much bureaucracies, so many promises which has not yet materialized on the ground, and yet so much pressure. And a little bit of politics, a lot of geopolitics in that discussion. Coming to climate finance and some of it, of course, the likes of CIFs, CDMs, which has come off, and such are tools that we are set aside by UNFCCC to make finance reach countries in Africa, together with other developing countries, but really very little of this has actually been able to trickle down to climate mitigation. For instance, climate adaptation funds, all of this has not been able to really reach African countries to the quantity it needs to in order to begin to contain the adverse effects of climate change within this continent. So I think that is very, very key to easing the flow of financing, both pre and post financing. Again, also to reduce the geopolitics. Some of the governance aspects that are contained in the declaration would address very key blockage of geopolitics. I'll give you an example. There was a time in the world when the development financial institutions would say that they wouldn't finance any coal or gas projects in the world, and of course financing for it was blocked for many African countries. But just after the Russian war that has happened, that seemed to open up again, and because some countries also in the north were also now developing gas. So those kind of rhetorics and geopolitics also needs to be, and I think that is also well captured and would be mitigated. The question is, would this declaration also then be followed to the latter in a way that would then be of very good advantage to African countries?
I mean, you've echoed some of the concerns that's been raised by activists over the years, and they're saying that there has to be a different approach, that unless there is a marked change in the approach to climate policies, the COP28 could fail to deliver any meaningful progress. Let me highlight some instances. In the Global South, there is persistent worry that wealthy nations, so you've also alluded to that, and international corporations, that they will push for policies that allow them to continue business as usual, while poorer countries, which are least responsible, like Africa, bear the brunt of the crisis. This tendency is not new. It's been observed at previous climate events, including the one that just held in Africa. Do you foresee that some lessons have been learned over the years and there will be a change in the dynamics and the conversations that will be had at COP28? Do you think this warning is important to keep us alert?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, of course, lessons are always learned every day. In this particular COP28 that is coming up in Dubai, between the 30th of November to the 12th of December, it is expected that so many, innovative solutions will come on the table. In the green zone, there will be a special session for private sector. I think this is also very, very important that private sector wakes up and begin to play a role as well. When we talk of climate change and climate change adaptation and mitigation, many people think that this is on the table of public sector alone or development financial institutions, but private sector needs to set up. So this is something that I think is a lesson that has been learned, that is having a strong focus on the private sector to bring them to shine a spotlight on them to begin to commit in specific ways how they can actually help to alleviate the adverse effects of climate change and how they can actually begin to contribute climate finance in solving it. Of course, one of the very big innovations that has been going on also in the world in terms of sinking out excess carbonization is the movement for green hydrogen production. Billions of dollars has been going going into it, and much more has been planned for it. Many people see it as the same as the silver bullet that would begin to suck out actually, the excess carbon in terms of, the hard-to-abate sectors like the iron, steel making sectors, the aviation, the shipping, those sectors that has been historically very hard to decarbonize or to reduce the amount of carbon that you use in their production or use. Green hydrogen became a vector that could actually help to reach that, make them green. So in this particular COP28, of course, there's going to be a lot of announcements of support for green hydrogen projects all over the world. The World Bank has already indicated that they would make an announcement. Currently, the EU is having their Hydrogen Week and have promised already upwards of 4 billion. So there are a lot of things that are going on which are innovative. And I think that this is an indication that lessons are also being learned.
How do you think, well, all of these that you've said will come to life to some degree at this COP28, that we can achieve some of the ambitions that's been put into that document?
Yeah, I think that one thing that needs to be done is once it's been documented and announced, one thing that is very, very important is to begin to track implementation actively. It's not enough to just make declarations and forget about it and wait for the next COP. It's very important for all the concerned stakeholders, including activists, to continue to track progress, to have meetings in between to check progress. How is progress of the last COP being achieved? I think that this is one of the ways that can really prevent a situation whereby you have made promises and made innovative steps, but announced it just by mouth, but not really materialized it on the ground, I think, which is usually the trend. So I think that we need to write more about it, we need to speak more about it, we need to hold the governments accountable, we need to hold the actors who make the promises accountable, and we need to hear in every upcoming COP what has already been done. How has the promises made in the previous ones been met? I think this is another way to really do this, and I think this is also something that Africans together can take up. What are the promises made towards the African countries? List them up, and then try to follow them to also hold the institutions that have promised this also accountable in delivering them.
I wanted to speak on the proposal for a climate justice fund and how this will better enable African countries to access additional funding for climate adaptation and restoration processes.
Yeah, of course. The climate justice is very important. It's a very important concept. Climate Justice Fund is something that I think that is needed at this point because, of course, it comes from the understanding, as I've begun to say earlier, of countries like Africa who has contributed much more or less to the climate change effects we are seeing are going to be the ones to suffer the most. So it then makes sense that some justice comes on the table. So having this understanding is very important as well for people who would contribute in this fund. So it's beyond aid. It's beyond aid. I think this is also very much highlighted in the ACAS that came up. This is not aid or handing out money. This is what needs to be done. This is what has to be done. So so justice is always very important. So I think it's very much important to keep in mind that this is not about numbers or keeping the temperature, global temperature not up to 1.5. It's not about numbers. It's not about figures. It's about human beings who are daily affected, in their daily lives, whose livelihood has gone off. It's about people who are losing their relatives on everyday daily basis because of this. It's about countries who are suffering significant amounts of losses as a result of it. So let's keep the people in mind when thinking about this fund and be able to then make what is required to make this fund operational. I think this is very important. So it's a very welcome idea to set up this fund. But what is very important to also do is to reduce the bureaucracy of assessing the financing from this fund. This is always what has marred every fund that comes out.
I mean, some would argue that the bureaucracy helps to keep the integrity of the fund going, because if anyone can come and access it, it might defeat the purpose, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the excess of everything can be bad. So some of these bureaucracies had historically been too complex. That some people would even argue that they spend so much money actually trying to even have access to such funds. I'm not saying that the funds should be left open to corruption, but there has to be a basic levels of bureaucracy and also very much effort to see that these funds are made explainable to people who would potentially apply for them, so that it's easier for people to apply. So what we have seen with other funds is that people were so discouraged to even bother to apply because the bureaucracy and the conditions were, first of all, not even clear to them. They were too complex for them. They didn't think that they even have chance. So it's important to begin to, first of all, simplify. Secondly, educate people on how they can access these funds. And thirdly, encourage them to do so. So these are the three things that I think that such a fund, which is very much welcome, but should need to also implement in order to be able to make it effective and touch the lives it's meant to touch.
Okay, as we wrap up, I want to ask about the push for technology. How can African countries push for this transfer and capacity building support to enable them implement restoration projects effectively? Because one thing is to, have the funding, the other is to be able to use it appropriately.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important aspect. Of course, such funds needs to be very well allocated. Africans should seek more to develop these technologies within themselves. But of course, we live in a geopolitical world. Everyone wants to be the one to develop the technology and sell, including Europe, including northern countries, global north countries. They also want to continue to grow their economies, and they want to also be technology leaders. You've heard about solar, even electrolysis that are going to use to be power hydrogen projects. Many countries are actually trying to be technology leaders. So I think that Africans should also join that trend, especially when you have the resources required for it, the mineral resources. It's good to insist that these technologies are developed on the soil where they are taken, instead of like exporting raw materials. It's good to often insist to have them processed and made. That is one. Secondly, of course, scaling and upscaling is very, very important in order to improve technology. So these actors, they need to be trained. People who are graduates, locals who are willing to be employed, needs to be employed and scaled and upscaled. This is another way to make sure that this fund is having not just an impact on climate change, but it's also having some trickle-down effects, empowering people economically, empowering people socially, and making sure that there is a multi-level progress, that the funds often unlock different development indices. So I think this is something to keep in mind. Yes. Yeah,
I think this is a good place to leave it and hope for the best at the event. It's just weeks away. Thank you very much, Chigozie, for speaking with us and for sharing your insights. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Take care.
All right, we'll go on a very short break. And when we come back, we'll be talking about the East Africa oil pipeline. We'll be asking questions around, is Uganda and Tanzania trying to invest their future on a fossil fuel that people suggest, climate experts suggest, might be on its way to extinction? Stay with us.